Go again.
Bridges, tunnels, crossings. My name is Tom. Mic test, mic test. Take that off, otherwise it'll... Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to London Metropolitan Archives. My name is Tom. I'm an Engagement Learning Officer here at the Archives, and it's my pleasure this afternoon to be talking to you about some of London's river crossings. This is a hybrid event, so obviously we have a group within us in the room today, but also, as you could probably guess from the setup here, we are broadcasting as well. So welcome if you've come to us in person, and welcome to those of you who are at home as well. Just a few pieces of housekeeping before we start. So for the benefit of people in the room today, I should say that we're not expecting the fire alarm to go off this afternoon, so should it go off we need to leave the building, and we'll evacuate through the doors at the back of the room, mainly down the main set of stairs, and leave the archive behind the main entrance. And should you need the loos at all, they're just again through these doors, they're tucked around the corner in the exhibition there. And for people at home, any problems with sound, if I you can stop hearing me, anything like that, any problem with sound and vision, please just pop that in the chat, and Jack will be looking after the chat. If you have questions as well as we're going along, please feel free to pop the questions in the chat as well. We'll take questions all together at the end, but sometimes particularly if you're at home, it can be easier to pop them as you go along, so that's fine. And we'll take questions from the room and at home at the end of the presentation. I think that's everything vitally important from housekeeping. I missed anything vital, do you think, Jack? Well, we'll call that housekeeping then. So welcome again. So this is a talk entitled Over, Across and Under, and we're looking at the history of London's river crossings today. The inspiration for this talk was because March 1973 was the official opening of London Bridge by the late Queen Elizabeth II, and I thought it would be a nice opportunity, therefore, to delve into this sort of interesting and rich history. But it's a very long history, almost 2,000 years worth of history, and various people, engineering marvels and topics along the way. So you'll forgive me if this is very much a meandering wander through this topic, a little bit here, a little bit there. The plan is certainly not to do 2,000 years of history in 45 minutes or so. Rather, it's to tell what I think are some of the interesting stories that have come from London's river crossings. I think most importantly as well, to give you some ideas, the sort of content we have on London Picture Archive, that's our online image database. So if there are particular topics and people and places that are interesting to you, you will be able to follow that up. And with the exception of, I think, 2 slides, all the images that we were looking at today are available on London Picture Archive. And what you see on the screen at the bottom there is the reference number and the title on London Picture Archive. So do please feel free to follow any of those links up should you want to. And the talk will be made available via YouTube afterwards as well. So if you want to recap anything either at home or online, please feel free to do so. So I said 2,000 years of history along the River Thames. So the history of London river crossings along Thames really goes back to the start of London itself. London, as we know it today, was founded by the Romans following the conquest of around AD 40. And although obviously it's hard to be too definitive when we're dealing with nearly 2,000 years ago, the scholarly consensus is that the site of what we now call London, Londinium in its Roman incarnation, was chosen as a favourable place to cross the river. It was chosen as a place where there was enough of a tide that you could have assistance from the tide, but not so much that the tide would be disruptive, and the topography of the land allowed for something of a natural ford and a stable place to build a river. So we have suggestions that right from, as I say, around AD 40, there was a military-style pontoon bridge built at roughly the site of today's London Bridge. And from there we see various incarnations of London Bridge right up till the present day, where it's still a prominent and important river crossing, but perhaps doesn't enjoy the preeminence that it once did, with so many other river crossings and so many other sort of architectural marvels along the way. The current London Bridge is actually in itself something of an architectural innovation, but it probably does with perhaps less style than some of the other bridges, we might say, along the Thames. So we have, as I say, we have the Romans to thank for London Bridge and the site of London Bridge. The Roman occupation, for want of a better word, of London, inhabitation, probably a better choice of word, finishes around 400 AD, a little earlier in fact, and then we see Roman Londinium fall into ruin as the Anglo-Saxon settlement is slightly further along as into the west, around Aldwych, but then as the various sort of the Vikings just realise that there's good plunder to be had on these islands, we see various sort of Viking shenanigans going on, and London, the ruined London walls are become a useful defensive operation for the Anglo-Saxons. They've moved back in, and life along London Bridge starts to revive. And through that time, we see various timber bridges coming and going. But it's not until the 13th century that we see the first stone bridge on the site of London Bridge, and the The history of that is wrapped up with that sort of, not quite, but almost the patron saint of London, Sir Thomas à Becket, the penitent king Henry II, and that famously troublesome priest. So it's a story that will be familiar to many of you. Henry II and Thomas à Becket are friends and colleagues growing up. But when Thomas is made Archbishop of Canterbury, trouble ensues. He is murdered at the behest of the king, and to much disdain, much despair of the people of London. And in order to make up for this, to atone for this, Henry II invokes various penances, foremost of which I think that survive today is the rebuilding of the timber London Bridge in stone. And as part of that, there is a chapel dedicated to Sir Thomas Becket installed in the bridge. And this then becomes the start of a famous pilgrimage route from London down to Canterbury, immortalised probably most famously, of course, in the Canterbury Tales, but it's a site of pilgrimage ever since. And that also gives a suggestion of another important part of the history of London Bridge and river crossings more generally, that for many years, and by many years I'm talking centuries, this was the only way in and way across the road in and out of the city of London, the most historical part of London. It was the main thoroughfare, and it would be therefore funnel trade, funnel people as it went in. So we can see this is although we are talking of a medieval bridge, the image itself that we can see here is later. This is from a panorama by Vischer from 1616, but it depicts the bridge in something like its medieval format. And there are a few things that stand out straight away from this image, and there's a few things that, depending on the sharpness of your eyes and the resolution of the screen that you're watching on, might be nice to point out as well. The first thing to say is it's different from what we might think of as a bridge today. We think of today, the primary purpose of bridge is to get you from one side of the river or one side of some kind of obstacle to the other. We don't think of it as a place to live, perhaps. We don't think of it as a place to go shopping. But you can see here on the medieval London Bridge, you're able to do both of those things in abundance. It was prime real estate in the medieval city. It was known to attract the sort of the highest, sort of upmarket shops, and it was seen as a healthy place to live as well. The air was seen to be fresher here, and clean air was linked with good health as well. So if you had the means to do so, you would try and live on the bridge or live above the bridge there. Indeed, it's probably a coincidence, but it was noted that there were less instances of plague when plague did grip the city among the inhabitants of the bridge than in the rest. It might be coincidence, it might be living, but that was something that was noted at the time. So it was desirable to live on the bridge for those reasons. So we're struck by the shops, the built-up nature of the bridge. What else can we notice from this print, as I say, from the 17th century? Bit harder to see, perhaps, and it's a bit gruesome. But if we take if we look at what would be the southern end of the bridge, so the bottom end of the bridge on the gatehouse there, you may or may not be able to make out the heads on spikes. So one of the famous features of London Bridge, of course, was where the heads of traitors were displayed, dipped in tar and then displayed. This rather gruesome and unpleasant tradition started in the early 14th century, following the capture and execution of William Wallace, the Scottish noble and general, famously defeating English armies in the early part of the 14th century. Excuse me. So his was the prototype, but various others, unfortunates, ended up there as well, including Jack Cade from the famous Jack Cade's Rebellion, another Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell as well. All ended up here. As I said, the heads were first dipped in tar and then left for what could be many years, even decades. And the punishment for taking down a head was basically for your head to end up there as well. So that was a method of continuing this rather gruesome process. And it's one of those examples of the past being a foreign country, because some people, because not just anyone ended up with their head on London Bridge. You have to have done something of quite, you have to have been a traitor and have done something really quite treacherous and really quite threatening. So we hear that some people actually took it as a compliment if one of their relatives' heads ended up on London Bridge. You had to be that good / bad to end up there. Other things that we might notice in this print is the general busyness along the Thames. So today we think of, when we think of crossing the river, we probably think of doing so by road, by doing so on a bridge. There's a bit of traffic, water traffic up and down the bridge, but there isn't a huge amount today. London back then was a far busier port than it is today, and more of that commercial and mercantile traffic would end up further down the river, more into central London. And also, as we'll hear, because of the problems crossing the river using London Bridge and the lack of alternatives, actually a very important way to get across the river was through the use of small boats known as wherries. If it was a person, you'd use a waterman. If it was goods, you'd use a lighterman. We'll hear more about them momentarily. Yes, so there we go. Keep on getting how to change slides. There we go. And then the final thing to, I suppose, to say about this slide is to notice Southwark Cathedral here, and that this being the traditional start of London Bridge. This will move up and down a little bit as it's rebuilt, but this was always seen as the spiritual entrance way to London, Southwark Cathedral in the south and St Magnus the Martyr in the north.
Can I ask you a question?
If we could, I prefer to take questions at the end, if that's okay, sir. Yes. So we have for many years, and by many years we are talking centuries, we have just the one crossing, road crossing, excuse me, over the Thames. If you wanted to cross elsewhere, you would take the services of a waterman or a lighterman, and that wasn't a coincidence. There had been suggestions over the centuries to put new river crossings in, but they didn't always come about, and that was really through both the waterman and the City of London Corporation itself trying to protect their commercial interest. They could make money. The watermen themselves would make money bringing people to and across the Thames, of course, and the City of London was aware that it being the only crossing point, it would bring people in to the city, not other parts of the city, as in city as in City of London, city as in wider city, the larger part of the urban area. But eventually, this monopoly on bridges is starting to broken down by Putney Bridge in 1729, and what we might really think of as the second bridge in central London, Westminster Bridge, which opens in 1750. And here we can see Westminster, the newly opened Westminster Bridge, as depicted from Lambeth, really probably around appropriate enough Horseferry Road today, or the site of the modern Lambeth Bridge. And this gives us again that sense of not needing a bridge necessarily to cross a river. We can see the sailboats, but we can also see the rowing boats there. And at the bottom right hand corner there, you can see people arranging to be crossed. This, as is sort of fitting of this style of work, depicts a very genteel scene, a very almost bucolic scene, the serenity of the river. Imagine oars dipping through. If you do spend any time around water, it can be a very relaxing medium. But we always have to be careful because things like this flatter to deceive. So the watermen, here again, here again, in showing a sort of quite serene position, were famous for their skill. We know that of them as being very skilled oarsmen, but also famous for being rather rough characters, famous for being rather burly and rather dangerous as well. So we know this from various accounts, and of both their behaviour to their customers and amongst each other. And one example of both the skill and the sort of the rough and tumble character of the waterman was given was the famous practice of shooting the bridge, or to shoot the bridge. So the bridge in question, fittingly enough, is London Bridge. We can see it depicted on the right hand side there. And what you get from this image, I think, is a sense of a dangerous piece of river. So London Bridge was constructed as an arch bridge. Off the top of my head, I want to say 19 arches in total, and then around those arches as well, what were called starlings. Starlings were additional pieces of construction designed to protect the piers of the bridge from the depredations of the river. You can just about make one out actually. If you look to the right-hand side of the image, there's an arch that's bigger than the rest. Either side, there's a protrusion coming out from the bottom of the river line. That's an example of a starling. And what this does is it bottles up the river. It slows the river down on one side, and also effectively lowers the level of the river on the other side. If you push water through a narrow gap, the pressure obviously increases, and if you add height to that as well, it drops. In effect, it was a man-made weir, and when the Thames was in full flow, this was a dangerous rapid. But young men, being young men in whatever century they live, saw that as a challenge rather than something to be avoided, and particularly the younger watermen would brag at each other their ability to shoot the bridge. Many did it successfully, but we hear figures of up to 50 people a year drowning doing this practice. So this was something very dangerous indeed. And there was a saying that went around London, particularly at the time of Samuel Pepys, that the bridge was for wise men to pass over and fools to pass under. We get another example of the insalubrious character of the waterman in this print, which is part of Ackerman's Microcosm of London. No, excuse me, Miseries of London. Excuse me, lovely aquatint. And here we can see how quickly, how assistantly the watermen work when it came to plying their trade. The text is small and poorly situated. So let me read it to you. Entering upon any of the bridges of London or any of the passages leading to the Thames, being assailed by a group of watermen holding out their hands and bawling out. So we hear that they are always trying to get trade. And in the example we can see on the river there, it looks like this lady is crossing that river, whether she wants to or not. And we also hear that we can see the competition there, that five watermen for one customer. It was standard practice known as river wit to hurl torrents of abuse at your colleagues who got the fare rather than you. And one final example of quite how much hustle, how much game, to use the modern expressions, these watermen had, was when those few occasions where the River Thames would freeze over. Indeed, another artefact of the narrowing of the river by London Bridge. The combination of it slowing down the flow on one side with a series of cold winters known as the Little Ice Age meant that from time to time, every century or so, there could be a frost fair on the River Thames. And this is as happened the last frost fair of 1814. So you would think that if the River Thames was frozen over and it was safe to walk across, you wouldn't need to pay a waterman. Well, not so. You can see here them charging entry for admission onto the frozen Thames. So just if you didn't see the mouse moving, that's on the right-hand side in the middle. They're arranging entry, and you can see all the festivities there going on. This, as I say, from 1814. And many of there's sort of a Napoleonic Wars theme to many of the activities. So the tent here at the front reads Wellington, Moscow. We're not long after the famous defeat. So we're just before the Battle of Waterloo, but we're after the main defeat in the Napoleonic Wars. You can get good gin. You can get top left-hand side there, various other entertainments as well. And if it sounds risky having cooking meat and doing various other things on a frozen river, well, indeed it was. As the fair lasted 3 or 4 days. On the 5th of February 1814, the ice started to break up, and several people did sadly drown. We don't really see much of watermen today. The famous social commentator Henry Mayhew talks about new bridges and new developments along the river, eroding the ability for this to be a viable trade. But there's, I suppose, a vestige in this in going across rather than over the river in ferries, most famously or the Woolwich ferry, the Woolwich Free Ferry. And the reason we have, I suppose, a ferry is because of the famous dearth of bridges east of Tower Bridge. And here we can see two generations of ferries. The first free ferry, when the service started in 1889, the Gordon, named after General Gordon, and in 1963 the James Newman, named not after the Eurovision singer but after a famous teacher and mayor of Woolwich. On the left, this is a paddle steamer, and on the right, this has 3 diesel engine motors, both providing a free and popular service to this very day. So we talked about the trade, the new bridges opening up, eroding the ability of the watermen to make a good living. So after sort of much obstruction, we see Westminster Bridge open in 1750, and then we see a spate. Then we see a spate of bridges opening in relatively quick succession. We see Blackfriars Bridge in 1769, Kew Bridge in 1759, Battersea Bridge in 1773, and Richmond Bridge in 1777. And there is a bit of a pattern to these bridges, as there is a bit of a pattern to much sort of infrastructure in this period of London history, which is that these are often private enterprises or a combination of private and some local, some sort of what now today call some kind of local government body. And there was an idea that these projects would pay for themselves through the levying of tolls across the bridges, an idea that really never panned out in practice. We see by 1889 the bridges becoming free when they become under the auspices of the Metropolitan Board of Works. And then the other pattern that is quite sadly that we see in the bridges built in this period is that the one we have today is very seldom, if never, the original one. So often they were defects in the building of the bridge, which means they don't last. Those of you familiar with Blackfriars Bridge will be familiar with the view of St Paul's in the background, of course. But Blackfriars Bridge today does not look like this. So this was a Portland stone arch bridge built in Portland stone. But the construction in this case was shoddy, and although it only opened, as we heard, in the 1760s, by 1833, extensive repairs were necessary, and then by the 1860s, a new bridge needed to be opened. We've talked so far about road bridges, but we should also mention, of course, that at this time London is gripped, and the country indeed is gripped, by the famous railway mania. So it's now not just road bridges that are being built. We also see the construction of various railway bridges as well at this stage. And again, the reason we have quite so many is because the railways were built as an exercise in the free market, in private competition. So various railway companies would build their own lines, and where necessary as well, their own bridges as well. And this is a view from 1864 of the Blackfriars Railway Bridge being constructed. It was not lost on the powers that would be in the City of London. The new bridges were being built, and that to have a good bridge that's both stable in its construction and, most importantly, relatively traffic free, would allow commerce and wealth to flow to your part of London. So by the latter half of the 1700s, the city authorities could sense that the writing was on the wall for London Bridge. It had long since been the shops that we saw had been taken down to make more room, but even so, it was still a massive point of congestion, and it could take as long as an hour to get across the bridge. So much so was the weight of traffic going across the bridge. So suggestions were, a competition was held for new designs for the bridge, and in 1799. Thomas Telford, the famous engineer, submitted this entry for a single span iron arch bridge, measuring, as we can see there, 180 meters, with 20 meter clearance underneath to allow ships to flow down the river. This was an innovative, even groundbreaking design, and although it was deemed safe, it was eventually deemed too expensive. Not so much the construction of the bridge itself, but rather, as you can see, on either bank of the river, on either bank of the river, a huge sort of structure is required, and the purchasing of the land was deemed too expensive to make the realization of this bridge possible. So a more conventional design by John Rennie, who we will call John Rennie the Elder, was submitted and accepted, and that design was realised by his son, also called John Rennie, to make life slightly confusing. And the new bridge is opened by 1831, and in an interesting and kind of considerate feature, which reveals the importance of the bridge for the smooth and safe running of London. We can see that as one bridge was being built, the other was left to pass traffic. So this rather nice print of the old and the new. So that's the old bridge on the right. As I said, you can see it's been shorn of its shops to allow for better passing of traffic. And then on the left-hand side there, we can see the new bridge. And the inspiration for this talk was the royal opening of a bridge, and here we have an older incarnation of a royal opening. So this is 1831. The royal in question this time was King William IV, and we can see the pageantry. And we can see the pageantry here, the royal barge going along the river, the decorations with the flags, and so on and so forth there, and the renaming of the street north of the bridge, King William Street, is in relation to this opening event. Although the new bridge was designed to allow for the smooth flow of traffic, as is always the way whenever new roads, new bridges are built, soon they're over capacity. And this is London Bridge in 1896. Here you can see again that it being thronged with people, horses, and carts as well, various loads coming into the city. And actually, just quite charmingly, at the right hand side there, you can see the steamer there as well. Give us a sense of the river being a working river in a way perhaps it isn't so much today. So the continued congestion along continued congestion along London Bridge meant that designs and submissions were really from as early as 1876. There was a new river crossing was in the air, but there was a problem with building a crossing east of London Bridge, that was a very busy and important part of the river. So it was known as the Pool of London, and it was and in particular it was just opposite the customs house. So there was a necessity for goods to be unloaded right there to kind of check the customs, to check the excise and various other things like that. So although there was a huge problem with traffic congestion across the river, as we saw in that last image, it was not as simple as simply building another bridge, because traffic still needs to go along as well as across the river. And this, as I'm sure some of you will know, is the genesis of what today is Tower Bridge. But we're going to get to Tower Bridge by a slightly circuitous route. So we have this problem of how do you cross the river? The obvious suggestion might be to a modern eye to build a tunnel, and here we have a suggestion of just that. So this is, although there was never a formal competition as such, it was well aware that you could submit suggestions for river crossings from around the 1870s, and they would be looked at. So this is, we would call it a tunnel, but the architects in question, so John Keith, described it as sub-Riverian arcade. Marketing, it turns out, is not a new invention. And there were several issues with this tunnel which meant that it wouldn't be built. First of all, in a similar vein to the Thomas Telford's Ironspan Bridge, it wasn't so much the cost of the crossing, but the land either side. To get the appropriate depth of a tunnel like this, much land, and literally the most expensive land in the country, needed to be bought up either side. So that was one significant issue. But the other, and this I say is when we're going to take a slightly circuitous route, is that although tunnelling was now proved to be possible along the Thames, it'd been a very difficult journey to get here, with much expense and misery, danger, and indeed death along the way. So before we get back to Tower Bridge, I want to just spend a few slides on, well, I think it's probably my favourite of the river crossings in a weird sort of way, which is the Thames Tunnel. So there had been various attempts to tunnel underneath the River Thames in the earlier 19th century. Many sort of famous and otherwise successful engineers who sort of plied their trade, particularly in mining, had attempted and failed. And by the 1820s, the engineering consensus was that it was impossible. The challenge being that the weight of the river and the geology, the nature of the combination of sand and clay would mean that the tunnel would collapse upon you. So although most people thought it was impossible, one person in particular thought it was possible, but only by adopting a new method of tunnelling. And the person in question was one Marc Brunel, father to the probably more famous Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Marc Brunel was a French emigre who fled France to save his skin during the French Revolution, and he'd made his fortune he didn't make his fortune. He'd made his name. Actually, didn't make a fortune. He'd made his name moving in naval circles. So he spent many times around shipyards. He created one of the first sort of mass production systems, production of pulley blocks. All this time spent around ships meant he would have been intimately familiar with one of the real pests of the age of sail, which is Tirado nivalis, or the shipworm. Call it a worm. Technically, it's a mollusk. This little critter, rather ugly beast, delights in munching its way through wood. It does this by, when we think of a mollusk, we think of mussel, something with a shell. The clever Tirado nivalis has repurposed its shell to be round its mouth. So what it can do, big jaw. It bores its way through wooden ships, but the strong shell at the front stops the hole from closing on it, and then it eats its way through one end, and the detritus goes out the other way. And this was the inspiration for Marc Brunel's tunnelling shield, that we can see actually in a bit more detail in this slide. So he thought, what if he was to mimic the biology of this in a new way of tunnelling? So this here, I'm afraid probably not the highest resolution, is Marc Brunel's new idea for what we today call a tunnelling shield or a boring shield. What you can see is that we have a group of workers at the front here side on, here front on, and what they are doing is there is a wooden frame is erected on the business end of the tunnel, the boring end of the tunnel, and this holds the tunnel mouth open. They are divided into little cells, little compartments, and each one of these is a very skilled miner, hacking away, picking away at the edge of the tunnel. It's forced against the tunnel edge with a series of hydraulic jacks. A certain amount is excavated, it's passed away. But the clever bit is, in the meantime, you can see people here taking out the spoil, but most importantly, it's being bricked up along the way. So the danger of the tunnel collapse. So there's less danger of the tunnel collapsing as people go. And it was by this method that the Thames Tunnel was built, and this became, as far as we know, the first example of a tunnel being dug underneath a navigable river. the way I described it there makes it sound very, very straightforward. Marc Brunel was one of those geniuses that had very, very good ideas that he then very much struggled to put into practice, or certainly put them into practice anything like the time and cost that he initially envisaged. The original plans for the Thames Tunnel would have had it being built in just under 2 years. In fact, and I like to get this one right. In fact, it took nearly 7. Oh, hang on, I've lost my notes. It took much longer than that. We'll get the next figure. Something in the region of 10 years, 7 years. So much longer. Go with that. And perhaps, and all joking aside, with far more damage, far more danger, and even loss of life. So one of the reasons that the work took so long was because although his method was vast improved on other examples, it was not without its failures, and it is worth saying it's just a fiendishly difficult task to tunnel underneath a river like the Thames. The combination of clay, which is relatively easy to tunnel through, but is not sort of really fixed, and then the geology as well at top meant that there's always a danger of inundation, and this happened in 1827, as we can see here. The tunnel was effectively too high. The riverbed was breached, and there was a flood. And here we see a cameo from the other very famous Brunel, Isambard Kingdom, who is in this diving bell here. So following one of these inundations, Mark was sent down in a diving bell to inspect the damage at where the river had breached the tunnel, and then he was fortuitously able to repair it by placing bags of clay along the top. So this was successful, and it was that repair was fixed. And to show how safe the tunnel now was, a banquet was held in the tunnel, and this is a really very risky thing to do. It really is an example, I say, of marketing and bricksmanship taken to the nth degree. And sadly, it wasn't the only. It would be hyperbolic to say that there was then a flood in one of these banquets, but you could still visit the tunnel as it was being built to attract attention, to attract money. And this was a time when people were fascinated by engineering and advances in engineering. So there's a second breach of the tunnel, which gave inspiration to this satirical print. And as you can gather what's happened, this is the scene as the supposed imagined scene as the water breaches the tunnel. I'll give you guys a minute to take it all in, take a sip of water, and there's a few that I think are really quite funny that we'll have a look at. So what we can see here is, as well as a comment on the danger of engineering, another bubble burst, is some sort of rather waspish comments around profiteering. I'm not sure if you can read this. It is quite tricky to read the type of script, but this sort of rather sort of miserly looking figure, this gaunt figure here, drab figure. You know, you could certainly see him as a Ebenezer Scrooge character in A Christmas Carol. He's saying, "If I can get out before interest passes, I shall sell my shares immediately." And we also see two marriages. I think we're going to assume they're marriages in very different states of happiness. So here we can see a figure saying, and let's hope that the microphone can read it. Here it says, "Oh, my poor dear wife, what shall I do?" He's feeding her brandy in an attempt to revive her. Then over here, we see a far less happy marriage, I'm afraid. So the wife here, burned down in her shoes and big skirt, is saying, "Don't run away from me, my John. What shall I she'll be drowned without you." And he's saying, "I should never have such a chance again." Here it goes. After much misery and danger, the tunnel was eventually finished, and it was known. Became a marvel of London, known as the eighth wonder of the world. In the first year that it opened, 2 million people came to view the came to view the tunnel. But as is often the way with such projects, it singularly failed to make a profit. It originally designed not just for pedestrians, but also the idea was that horse-drawn carriages would be able to go through it. But because of the cost overrun, there wasn't enough money to build the ramp that would allow this type of traffic to go through. So it became first a novelty, much like London Bridge. There were shops, quite upmarket shops, but it soon fell into disrepute and became known as the Hades Hotel, because it became known as a haunt for sex workers and other things such as that. And it became sort of fell in the sort of public estimation. But you can still visit today, in a manner of speaking. In the 1860s, it was incorporated. It was purchased by the East London Railway Company, and it's now part of, get this right, now it's part of the London Overground network, one of the parts where the London Overground confusingly goes underground. So you can just about go visit it today. So that was a long way of saying tunnels are hard work on the Thames. And so we're back now in the 1870s, and we're thinking, wrapping up, I suppose, thinking about some of the London bridges that could have been, rather than the ones that were. As we've heard, there was sort of an informal competition around the 1870s for new designs for a bridge east of London Bridge. This is the so-called duplex bridge. You can see here that it's this in this configuration in the middle. You can the roadway can be open and shut to allow boats to come through. There was also a design for a high-level elevator bridge, the idea being that the bridge wouldn't need to open or close, simply that you would take a lift up to a high level and move across. But this was deemed too expensive and too time-consuming to move traffic across. The famous Sir Joseph Bazalgette, chief engineer to the Metropolitan Board of Works, proposed a few far more prosaic designs for bridges, and these were rejected not so much on the grounds of their impracticality, but really as something of a turf war. So remember, this is a City of London project, and the City of London, for one reason or another, was hostile to the Metropolitan Board of Works, partly as they suspect it to be kind of corrupt and inefficient, but also because they saw them as a rival form of municipal government, and so the idea of their chief engineer building a bridge, City of London, would never really have come to pass. So the final design we have was by Horace Jones, who, not coincidentally, was in fact the chief job title like chief architect to the City of London Corporation, and it's the famous bascule design that we know and many of us will love today, from the French word for drawbridge or seesaw, I forget, opened in the middle to allow even the largest of ships to pass through into the Port of London. And this is HMS Belfast, which is, of course, many, not all of you will know, permanently resides now in the Port of London. I couldn't help but include this. Really, this is very much an aside, simply because I like the story. So we've talked about various forms of river crossing. You can go over, across, under. If you're particularly bold, you can even fly. So this is a record from the day book, effectively, at Tower Bridge from 1968. And in 4-5 rather terse and laconic lines, it records a protest undertaken by an RAF fighter pilot who was disgruntled with the lack of formal flypast to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Royal Air Force, and decided to take matters into his own hands and flew his Hawker Hunter aircraft along the River Thames, and then, as we can see here, between the high levels and the bascules of Tower Bridge, before flying off to undertake a series of mock attack runs on airfields on the southeast of London. After landing, he was deemed to be unfit on medical grounds. I think they specifically, and my understanding is, I don't want to cast aspersions, but that was to avoid a court-martial where he could give his side of the case. But to be fair, I think flying an aircraft through Tower Bridge is probably, it says something perhaps about your state of mind, if we can say nothing else. So that's really just a bit of fun, and it takes us now to the closing, the closing of the old London Bridge and the opening of the new. So by the late 1960s, in a image that we've seen before, but with just updated traffic. London Bridge was congested, and more dangerously, it was sinking at an alarming rate, about 8 inches a year, deemed unsafe, and repairs deemed too expensive. So a decision was made to build a new bridge of modern construction. Here we can see the construction work being undertaken at night in the new bridge, known as a box girder construction. As I said at the head of the talk, perhaps not as stylish as London Bridge or as charming as some of the older bridge, but in its own way, it's significant in terms of its architecture and engineering, in that it's 2 cantilevered sections with a box in the middle. So that was a technology that wasn't available to prior bridge builders. Famously, the old London Bridge wasn't demolished, as was the way of many what we now think of as important monuments at the time, in the 1960s. It was sold, and it was sold effectively sold to Lake Havasu City, to the McCulloch Oil, and to Dearborn McCulloch of the McCulloch Oil Company. There is, of course, that famous legend that grows in the tale. I used to work as a London tour guide, and we delighted in telling people that they bought the wrong bridge. You know, the story, if you were feeling particularly hyperbolic, is you'd almost give the impression they were unwrapping the bridge and they're expecting Tower Bridge and they got London Bridge. Sadly, like most urban legends, that's not quite true. So we can see here they knew exactly what they were buying here, and this is part of the bid of sale, effectively, between the City of London Corporation and the McCulloch Oil Company, and we can see just what they were buying. And if you're interested more in this story, on our YouTube channel, there is an extended piece of footage of the opening of the bridge in Lake Havasu City. That's quite a nice one to watch. And to take us back to the beginning, as we heard, in 1973, Queen Elizabeth II opens up London Bridge, and it's our latest incarnation of London Bridge, which many of us use to this day. So on that note, we will pause for questions. So I know there was a question at the back, sir. So we'll take that. Then we'll take some questions from the room. If you have questions at home, please start to type them in. We'll do a few questions from here, and then we'll do that there. I should say that our new microphone setup. We have a new microphone set up in the post, and so as of next time, we'll be able to have one microphone going around the room, one at the front. But until then, this time, bear with me if I repeat your question, probably slightly proceed, just for the benefit of the people at home who wouldn't be able to hear otherwise. So there was a question at the back, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering, with the bishop, and the river looks very deep from south to north.
Yeah, let me just scroll.
Also, the perspective seems to be taken from a high point.
Yeah.
I'm not aware that there are any high points behind Southwark Cathedral.
That's
I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, sure. So the first thing to say is that Vischer. Let me sure I get this right. I always get Vischer and Holler slightly muddled up. But if I'm getting my Dutch artist the right way round, Vischer never visited London. So this was made up of preparative sketches by other people. But you're quite right that this is from an imagined viewpoint. So it's an imagined viewpoint above Southwark Cathedral. So that's absolutely right. So it's designed to be topographically accurate, but that kind of liberty has been taken as well. Yeah.
And the depth of the river, it looks very, very deep. The crossing looks very wide.
Yeah.
Is the river considerably wider in those?
It was somewhat wide indeed. So during the 1860s, the Victoria Embankment was built. So that was to house London's new sewage system, and as that part, the river was narrowed at that stage. I'm not sure that I couldn't say. I don't think the embankment comes up that far, does it? So that's probably an artifact of the artistic process rather than a kind of historical record. Yeah, my pleasure. Are there other questions from the room? Yes.
With the new London Bridge,
Yeah.
There's a monument which is a spike.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a reference to the old London Bridge with the spikes?
Yes, indeed. So there's a question from the floor, just so everyone heard it. By the new London Bridge, so I think there's an Evans Cycles, isn't it? On the south side, there's a big spike there. Yes, that's from the sort of modern art sort of reference to the spikes that would go on the bridge. Yeah. Thank you. Any more questions from the room? Yes.
Yeah, when we had to buy the bridges and the land either side of it, were those, and you said that they were very expensive. Were those people typically compensated properly? And was there any difference between people who were wealthy were getting displaced and people who were poorer that were getting displaced?
Yes.
Were the poor sort of expropriated with nothing and the wealthy paid off?
Good question. So the question was about when land was bought for the building of new bridges, what was the compensation like, and was there a difference between the way that the wealthier were compensated and the less wealthy? So I don't know a huge amount about actually the compensation for the building of the bridges, but the general pattern is as you would expect. If you are well connected, you could expect proper compensation. We certainly see that with the building of the railways, and we also see nudging and nurdling of the route to make sure that it doesn't go through. If you're very well connected, you can affect the siting and the route. And absolutely, particularly in the 19th century, when there are huge changes into how London is built, there's a lot of what would have been called slum clearance at the time. The person that owns the property would be properly paid off. The 15 people that are living in the tiny room, less so. Less of an issue with the bridge on the city because it was already valuable real estate, but certainly that is the pattern. Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. We'll take some questions from home if there are any, Jack.
Yeah, we've got two from Wendy.
Hi, Wendy.
It's a bit of a quiz, this.
Okay.
So the first is, when were the accommodation and shops removed from London Bridge?
Yep.
And the second is, when was the Thames Tunnel completed?
Thames Tunnel. Okay, the Thames Tunnel completed.
You don't do this off by heart.
You weren't going to let me off the hook on that one. So the shops, doing it off by heart, the shops were removed, I want to say, in 1725. So basically, there was a fire. There was a fire, and they were removed as part of that. I think that's right. And Thames Tunnel, I want to say it was completed in 1838. But I might have to concede to my dear friend Dr. Google, which Wendy you will have access to. So you've reddened my face, but I'd rather admit when I'm wrong than abuse the podium and tell me when I'm.
You were very close.
Okay. What were the answers? Put me on my misery.
Thames Tunnel was completed in 1843.
Okay.
Google says that the houses were removed from London Bridge in 1657.
Okay.
So I don't think that's right.
Okay, jolly good.
I'm going to go for you.
We won't. Yeah, bless you. Trust authority rather than Google. Yeah. So thank you very much. Thanks, Wendy. Sorry not to be able to give more accurate answers. Are there other questions from home?
Yeah. Alex asked, what sorts of shops could you find on Old London Bridge, and is it true that there was once a joust held there?
I don't know about the joust. I just don't know either way. I've not heard that. Seems unlikely, but unlikely things happen. So it could be the case. In terms of the shops, I believe a big one was trade in cloth. That would have been a big one. And cloth is the one that I know of in particular, but other wares as well. But wool merchants is the one that I'm aware of.
Thanks.
Any other questions from home?
Not yet.
Jolly good. Any more questions from the room then? Yes.
Yes, to get across Old London Bridge with all the shops.
Yeah.
Could you just walk across, or was it tolled?
It would have been tolled for a part of it, and then the tolls were eventually removed. So the question was about tolls on London Bridge. Yes, there was tolls for part of its history, and then the tolls were eventually removed. Yeah. Thank you. There was a question at the back again, sir. Yeah.
Yes, I was just wondering, would the bridge in the picture have been as wide approximately as the current bridge, or do you think it would have been wider?
So the question was the relative width of the bridges. This would have been narrow. This is narrower than the bridge on display here is narrower than the modern bridge. So one of the reasons it became obsolete was its lack of width, and indeed there was some suggestion that this bridge could be widened rather than rebuilt. Thank you. I think we've got time for any last questions from the room, and then any last questions from home, if there are any, Jack.
Not that.
Okay. Any last questions then from the room? Okay, we'll have two questions from the room, and then if there's no more questions appear, then we'll call that a day. But otherwise, we'll take questions in the room. So we'll have Phil, and then we'll go here. Yeah.
Were there repeated fires on London Bridge? I mean, one can see smoke, it looks like smoke coming out from one of the, I mean, there was a high risk of fire, and also if there was a fire, how to escape?
Indeed.
Jumping into the water.
Indeed. So the question was, were there fires on London Bridge? Yes, absolutely. Very famous one in the 13th century, but other fires as well. And it's not the exact. I don't have sort of on my fingertips. It's not the sort of thing that survives very readily as we go farther back. But yes, very dangerous, and you might consider jumping into the river. But with all the perils that has, River Thames is a famously tricky river when it comes to tides and things like that. Yeah.
I was just wondering if we know where the materials of the old bridges went. Like Blackfriars Bridge, had to be rebuilt.
Yeah.
It must have contained an enormous amount of Portland stone.
Yeah.
Presumably it was dismantled.
Yes. Yeah.
Do we know exactly where it went, or was it just being lost?
So the question was, where does the stone from the various demolished bridges go? In some cases, I think people know. In some cases, you don't. But that's a really good point. That fine quality, but all building stone, but particularly fine quality building stone would have been reused. So I don't have it again at my fingertips, but yes, it's a sort of thing that can often be traced. And then so you can. That's definitely a thread you can pull on if you're interested. Absolutely, jolly good. And any questions from home, Jack? In which case, thank you again, everyone, for coming along this afternoon, either in person or at home, and hope to see you again soon. Thanks again.